Hello, I'm Juliette Foster and welcome to Business Matters. Cyber attacks are the scourge of modern business life, and if current trends are anything to go by, the danger is unlikely to recede anytime soon. A report by the cybersecurity company Checkpoint Software estimates that in the first quarter of 2025, businesses worldwide experienced an average of 1,925 cyber attacks per organisation per week. That's a 47% increase compared to the same period a year ago. Well, the numbers not only reveal the sophistication of the assaults, but the brazenness of those who planned them. No company, regardless of size, is immune, and the consequences for those caught off guard can be painful. The British high street giant Marks & Spencer took a £300 million hit to its trading profits after a major cyber assault. So what should businesses do to protect themselves? And has geopolitical uncertainty emboldened the hackers? Well, I'm joined in the studio by Steve Durbin. Steve is Chief Executive of the Information Security Forum, or the ISF, a global non-profit that helps businesses manage cyber risks. Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, what's your reaction to those figures?
Well, I think the thing about the whole industry is that we are inevitably maturing. So with that, from a negative perspective, if you like, you would expect to see these sorts of numbers increase for two reasons. First, the attacks are increasing. There's no question about that, because it is much easier to actually perform some form of attack. But secondly, of course, people are monitoring it more closely as well. So some of the things that perhaps were escaping under the radar are now being picked up. So I think, what I would say is that, yes, it is increasing. Those of us in the industry know that it's increasing. And I think actually, if we look around generally, people are becoming so much more aware now of some of the challenges of operating in a technologically environment that those are the sorts of numbers we're going to see going forward.
But does it mean that we've run out of time, this year at least, to break that upward trajectory? We've just simply got to run with it.
I think we do. I think we do have to run with it. I don't think there's any option other than to do that, I would say, Juliette. I mean, the bad guys only need to get lucky once and they can cause havoc. And so the sorts of numbers you're seeing are them plugging away at it, trying to break down defenses, trying to find a way through. And on the defensive side, of course, we have to be at the top of our game 24/7. And that's just impossible. It doesn't matter what industry you happen to be in, or even if you're an athlete, you are never going to be able to maintain a peak performance. So my point is that we will always see attacks taking place. And the more we see attempting, the more we'll eventually get through.
Right, but what is not in dispute is that these attacks have become more sophisticated in their planning and their execution.
Yes.
What's your take on that? Because you're an industry veteran. You've seen a lot in your time.
I think there are a few things that are going on. Certainly back in the day, when we used to talk about attacks, everybody immediately thought of this, hoodied individual in the kitchen. Well, we've matured so far beyond that. Crime now, cybercrime in particular, it's a real entrepreneurial industry. It's very, very large scale, and the big criminal operations are large scale enterprises. So they do have all the things that you would expect in terms of R&D, in terms of support infrastructure. So if you look at it from that perspective, we shouldn't be surprised because of this maturing. The other thing that's happening, of course, is we're now seeing AI coming into its own in its place. So you don't just have to have your own skill sets. You can go online. We have crime as a service, which is fairly widely spread. So you can purchase a particular element that you might want to try and drop on a particular customer that you're targeting, on an organization that you're targeting. They'll provide you with 24/7 help desks. In some cases, you may even get your money back if it doesn't work. So we're de-skilling to a certain extent as well. So the point of entry for a cyber criminal has lowered considerably. And I think that will continue as AI becomes much more sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to look at AI a little bit later in our conversation, but what I want to pick up on is this idea of these crimes being highly, highly organised, very industrial. That does appear to suggest that this type of crime is also connected to other areas of criminality. If that's the case, are we talking about gangs that are running this?
We are. I mean, I think we always have to be careful about which sort of cyber criminal we're talking about. So obviously we have state, nation-backed actors, highly sophisticated, not a particular challenge in terms of resourcing. They will typically be going after government-to-government type espionage.
So that's more of the geopolitical cybercrime.
Absolutely. But then if you come back a little bit from that, organised crime has certainly moved into this space because it's hugely lucrative.
Rich pickings.
Very rich pickings indeed. And again, with some of those organised crime bosses putting some of the money that's required into this particular area in terms of the potential return on investment that you can get, if you were a business leader in that space, you'd certainly be investing. So this is why I always refer to them as entrepreneurial organizations, because they do have business plans. They do understand where they can get a return. And so the days of it being a fairly sort of haphazard, let's give it a shot, are pretty much long gone. We still have some of those, but I always look at those as the sort of entry level. You need to try to prove yourself, in that space. And then if you've proved yourself there, you'll get a bit of a reputation and you can move up the tiers. In the cybercrime
but
space.
Obviously it creates incredible problems for law enforcement, but that's a conversation for another day. But let's take it back to the here and now. I mean, look, would you say from your experience that big companies are more vulnerable to cybercrimes than smaller companies, or have we now reached the point where size is really irrelevant?
I think with large organizations, they obviously have more resources available to make life difficult or more difficult for the cybercriminal. But we also have very, very complex supply chains now that obviously are made up of small to mid-size companies. If you look at the UK, vast majority of businesses in the UK are small to mid-size. If you go across to Europe, the same would be true in Germany and many of the other European countries as well, and also in the United States and Australia, of course. So an easier way of accessing some of this really, tasty information, if you like, high value information, is often via the third party. So you don't necessarily need to be attacking the larger enterprise. You can target a smaller to mid-size, which probably doesn't have the same level of defense, maybe not the same level of awareness. And because it's in the supply chain and sharing information, you can then access through to the larger enterprise. So a lot of larger organizations now are having to spend very much more time not just protecting their own specific defenses, but also looking at their supply chain and really advising them on what they should do, and much more importantly, perhaps, why they should do it.
And it's interesting because you kind of answered the question I was going to put to you just now, in fact, and that is, how do you choose your victim? Because the reality is that there are hundreds, thousands, millions of victims to choose from, and even just a random selection can lead you to the bigger prize.
That's absolutely right. And I suppose the sadder element of it, really, because people listening to this may take the view that organizations should be able to look after themselves. But we mustn't forget that organizations are essentially made up of people, the likes of you and I. We too fit into that supply chain. And so the targeting of the individual, because we're all technologically enabled in some way, shape or form, right? We'll have phones, we'll have laptops, we'll have tablets, we'll be accessing our bank accounts, we're doing all sorts of things. That's also quite an interesting way to begin, certainly on a much more industrial level, to actually try to sort of, it's a bit like trawling for fish, if you want to look at it that way. If you throw your net over, draw your boat through, you will pick up something. And it's the same with at that sort of people level, if you like. If you put enough phishing out there with a PH as opposed to an F, then people will inevitably respond, and then you'll be in there and do all sorts of things with the information you've gathered.
Absolutely. There are huge questions as well about staffing within organisations and upskilling and preparing people for AI, how to use it and how to actually combat the bad guys. But in terms of risk, would you say that there are some sectors which are more at risk than others because of what they do? Just as examples, pharmaceuticals and defence. Now, if they were hacked, the consequences could be very serious.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you look at traditionally what's happened, the financial services organizations have always tended to be, the prime targets because that's where the money has been. Increasingly, of course, the ability to monetize, as you rightly point out, in the pharma space has dragged people more into that. The value of intellectual property in there. One of the things I've always been afraid of and worried about is not so much the stealing of data, but just the tweaking of data. So the manipulation of it so that you don't even notice, perhaps. And so you may then be producing product that is essentially flawed, or you may be making decisions that are flawed. So I think there's that component. And you're absolutely right to point out defense. Today, of course, with all that's going on in the world geopolitically, the defense sector is certainly under attack in a very different kind of way, not just in terms of trying to exfiltrate information around perhaps product development, weapons development, and so on, but also about exactly what is going on. Where are some of these things going? What are the sorts of things?
So some forms of espionage as well.
Absolutely.
But I mean, look, we can talk about the responsibility on the part of sectors and companies, but what about regulation? Do you think that the current state of regulation is actually keeping pace with the evolution of these attacks, or that entire landscape? And how can it keep pace? Because everything is changing so quickly. That's always going to be a constant battle, isn't it?
It is. And I probably need to sort of say right up front, I'm not a big fan of regulation for a couple of reasons. The first and most importantly is that regulation always tends to lag the market. And so it's always going to be playing catch up. I think the second reason why I'm not a big fan of it is that a lot of regulation, of course, is made by politicians who may not be getting necessarily best advice in terms of what's in the best interest of the industry.
Interesting, though, because there is the argument that governments perhaps need to go further to a certain extent and mandate cybersecurity compliance for companies which operate in very sensitive sectors. I mean, I talked about defence and pharmaceutical, but also energy or healthcare.
Yeah.
So what should or could that look like if a government was brave enough to venture into that territory?
Well, I think we do already have some fairly strong guidelines for critical national infrastructure, which are the sectors that you're referring to there. I think where I get more worried is when we move outside of that and we begin to try to regulate what you or I do. Because I think, we have to understand that to a certain extent, cyber is and cybercrime is facilitated by the internet. The internet was never regulated. We missed an opportunity to do that many years ago. And so I'm not saying don't regulate at all. What I'm saying is let's look at it in a measured way. Let's look at what is possible. So let's actually be very sensible about what we can.
In other words, standing away from the noise, because there tends to be a lot of noise when you've had a security breach.
Exactly. And that's where the politicians then begin to see an opportunity. And before we know it, we've created something that's very difficult to wind back.
What should businesses themselves be doing to tailor their risk profile around individual perceptions of what is a genuine risk? In other words, is there an acceptable universal definition of risk that all businesses, regardless of what they do, how big or small they are, should be buying into?
I would say not. Pretty much every business I've ever worked with or dealt with has been individual to a certain extent. So they will all have their different risk appetites. And that may change over the life of an organization. So you would adopt a different risk appetite, for instance, if you're about to launch a new product, or if you had the misfortune to be in a market that suddenly had a war breakout. So there are lots of different things in the life of an organization when we think about risk. So you will always start with your basic level of what is acceptable. You have to protect your employees, you have to protect your shareholders, you have to protect your customers. You have to make sure that the business itself is robust. We talk a lot at my organization about protecting the crown jewels, the things that absolutely have to be looked after in order for your business to still function. So all of that gets rolled into the risk mix. And frankly, businesses have been very, very good at doing that for a large number of years. So what we're now doing is we're adding cyber into that space. So for me, businesses know how to manage risk. They don't need much advice in how to do that. What they do need to understand is that cyber risk is not that different. It's just a different component as far as a business is concerned, something else that we have to manage. So put it into the same process that you've already set up. You've probably got in a very rigorous way because you're running a successful business, and off you go. So let's not overcomplicate it.
Right. So just treat it as any other risk.
Absolutely.
It's no different to any other risk. But let's throw it back onto the companies themselves, because, you know, you work with a lot of companies telling them or showing them what they can do to protect themselves. But have you ever come across a situation where perhaps a company is frighteningly casual about its cybersecurity dangers because it feels, you know what, we're a really big brand. So because we are known in whatever the field is, no one's going to touch us because they just think, hey, you know, they're too complex. Let's go over there because that's an easier target. Do some companies rely too much on their profile as a deterrent?
I would say not anymore. I think we've seen some fairly large scale attacks just this year alone with very large brands.
Certainly Marks and Spencer, as I mentioned in the introduction.
Marks and Spencer's being one, of course, but Dior being another one. You know, so brands that perhaps people would think, oh, I thought they would have been, you know, good enough. And it's the sad thing is it's not about being good enough. If you are determined, you can pretty much breach any organization out there. So what organizations have to do is not bury their head in the sand, and not many of them are, but they have to plan for the day when it happens. So they have to go through a fairly rigorous
work on
process.
the possibility that it will happen, even if
Absolutely.
it doesn't.
Absolutely. And then how are you going to respond to that? Because that's the important piece. You know, what is your response mechanism? Because that will determine whether you're viewed as being a competent company versus one that perhaps hasn't done its homework. And, you know, the impact that can have on shareholder confidence, on valuation, but much more importantly, just on cleanup, the cleanup cost, which can run for months and months.
I mean, look, the intention is there for many businesses. We know that. But half the problem is that the technology itself isn't static. You can actually employ a strategy that works today, but tomorrow it can be redundant. So that surely has to be the next question. I mean, how often should companies actually update their security strategies without running the risk of buying into technology, which becomes very, very expensive and potentially, in some instances, unnecessary?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question that you asked me there, because I think my where I stand on this is that we are spending too much time as an industry banging the drum for security being separate from the business. It isn't. There isn't a business out there that isn't dependent upon technology in some way, shape, or form. If you are dependent upon technology, you have to have good security in place. And so the focus then shifts. So to the point about strategy, how often are you reviewing your business strategy would be my question. And security should be a component of that. They shouldn't be separate, because technology, security, they're all going to help you deliver your business strategy, whatever that may look like. So if you have a, 3-year review, that's how often you should be rolling your security strategy into it. If it's a 6-month rolling review, which I happen to prefer because things move so much more quickly, to your point, then again, it's rolled into that as well. So where I think a lot of mistakes are made is by separating these two things out. And if we could bring them back together and view it much more holistically across the organization, as to the point I was making earlier about risk, then I think life will become a lot easier, not just for the security people who are always trying to get their message across, but also for the business side of the house who are desperately trying to understand what it is that they need to be doing.
Yeah, because look, what we're talking about here is a good cyber strategy relying on collaboration. In other words, the human. And that has to be the key thing, isn't it? That how do you actually bring together the two, strike that balance between security and humans? Because whenever we talk about technology in the wider world, the conversation tends to work on the basis that eventually the human will be redundant. We haven't got there yet. The two need to work together. How can you do that so that technology is not seen as the silver bullet that rubs out 1,000 potential sins?
Yeah, I think that for me, the future actually for the human is pretty bright. But I see the human having to work in collaboration with technology, as you're pointing out, and vice versa. So I don't see a day where AI would replace people entirely. I think that AI and other technology tools are just that. They are tools.
Right, but it's also upskilling people as well, though, because you've got a generation of workers who use technology in a certain way. You bring in the AI, and that's going to change the landscape in itself. So how can you actually prepare a workforce to use the current AI models which are available now in readiness for the future?
It's to your point about upskilling. You have to invest in training. You have to invest in actually looking at the skill sets that you need within your organization and making some hard calls, as to whether or not you do have the right capabilities within your organization. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get rid of a lot of people. It means you probably do need to invest significantly in upskilling, in training, and thinking very, very hard about how you're going to use some of that new technology. And again, I think there is a little bit of an illusion out there that suddenly you drop in AI and we can all walk away. The reality is that you have to spend a tremendous amount of time thinking through how those projects are going to work, looking at how they're then going to deliver value for you, and then changing them. Because then you begin to understand the actual power of the technology that you're implementing. And this is the sort of thing that certainly the financial services sector has been doing for a while. Pharmaceuticals have been doing it for a while. But there is this sort of misconception, I think, for a lot of people that AI is just this easy to use thing, because we're all familiar with ChatGPT and its brothers and sisters.
That's at a very basic level.
But that's at a very, very basic level. Using it within an organization for real business value is not a trivial exercise.
It's more complex, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
But look, what we're talking about here is restructuring workforces. That is the reality. And obviously, technology has exacerbated that need, especially given the cyber dangers which are out there. But also as well, a lot of companies have to wrestle with silos. Do you think that silos increase the vulnerability of businesses to cyber attacks?
I do. I also think that the silo slows business down. So I'm a big fan of everybody understanding what it is that the business is trying to do and fully understanding the role that they play in that, and also the interconnections between the different departments. So, for instance, sales is never going to be any good without good marketing. Marketing is never going to be, effective without understanding the way in which the business is running. Finance needs to have an overall view across all of that. I'm stating the obvious, but if you then put technology into that, those systems need to interrelate, and then throw AI into it as well, and you begin to see the sort of mesh that we're building here in terms of everybody needing to understand what's happening. Businesses are team sports. You have to have everybody understanding what they're trying to do, and everybody will have a different role, but it will be interlinked in some kind of way. So when we talk about things like cyber, or we talk about technology, for me, the thing that perhaps we don't spend enough time talking about is the transformation that's required within the organization to get the best return from what we're actually doing. And that's where I think we're starting to see more people spending time now. And security is starting to drive that, because security has to be recognized in a new way. And so the security leaders are trying to find a different way of doing it. And that's where this whole transformational piece is coming in.
But do you also feel perhaps that the dangers, the risks posed by cyber attacks is perhaps strengthening the case to reduce remote working, to actually get people working together under the same roof, in getting people to invest in the idea, because you are ultimately working to protect the organization from which all of us will benefit?
I don't think remote working, and some people may be surprised to hear me say this, I don't think remote working has anything to do with security.
You don't think it makes a company more vulnerable to cyber attack?
I don't actually. I think what it does do is it may emphasize certain areas that company needs to focus on better. So if I have a remote workforce, how do I make them secure? How do I communicate better with them? How do I have them understand why they need to do things? These are some of the things that we need to be spending our time in. It's explaining the why. If I say to you, Juliet, if you want to access your bank account, there's this great new bank out there, and they've got all these great levels of security. You'll say, okay, that may be interesting. I'll say the only downside, slight downside, take you an hour to log into your account.
Well, bank charges probably would have been the downside.
But you're not even going to go there, right?
Yeah.
So it's always about a trade-off.
Yeah, quick access.
So you need to look at why people need to do things. If I said to you that your money is going to be 100% safe, there are going to be 0 bank charges, but it will take you longer to access it, you may do it. So we have to explain more why we're doing things, because technology is becoming more complex, cyber security is becoming more complex, and we're making an assumption that people will know why it's necessary, and actually they don't. So I think from a business perspective, leaders need to spend more time explaining what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then you'll bring people along with you.
Yeah, to get that multiple sense of investment. But I mean, look, there are so many pressures in that business space, and obviously cybersecurity underscores that. But how are cybersecurity teams actually evolving so that they can better align with the business goals of a company? Because the bottom line is that businesses are there to produce the goods, to ultimately produce a profit from which the shareholders and others will benefit.
And it's something that we've spent a lot of time looking at, and we've talked about, putting security into the business so that you have somebody actually working with the business department who can provide that advice and guidance in the moment. We've looked at, re-educating, upskilling the board, for instance. And the answer is it's all of those different things. For me, it's about how do you completely integrate security into your business strategy. If you can do that, some of these problems just go away. So you don't have this almost territorial dispute between, what should security be doing and what should the business be doing. We have to work better together.
But look, the bottom line is that businesses are operating in a highly competitive landscape. There are all sorts of dangers, etc. There are some things over which they do have control, but other things outside of their control. We were talking about skills in terms of upskilling internally, but it's finding the professionals outside of an organisation to bring them in. And the reality is that there is a shortage of good skills, and particularly the sort of skills that can take on the cybersecurity challenges.
That's absolutely right. And we've talked for years in the industry about, a lack of skills. We've contributed to some of that problem ourselves by setting the bar too high. So we do expect, people to be the finished article when they come into a security department. That isn't necessarily the case. I mean, certainly I look much more for aptitude, for interest, for ability, the willingness to learn. And you can get those sorts of skill sets from people who've studied the arts, from people who've done all sorts of different things. So I think from an industry standpoint, we need to be more open-minded. There's no doubt, though, that we need also to be investing in people who are coming through our school and education systems.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. But Steve Durbin, Chief Executive of the Information Security Forum, or the ISF, thank you so much for joining me. I'm Juliet Foster, and you've been watching Business Matters.